among other things. Throughout that public testimony this week, Cohen identified Weisselberg by name more than 20 times. And as a result, he has now come under increased scrutiny by Congress. After 45 years with the Trump family business, Weisselberg's value as a potential witness can't be understated. His former Trump campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, said in his recent book, quote, Weisselberg knows of every dime that leaves the building. In fact, Weisselberg already received partial immunity from prosecutors last summer for his testimony about hush money payments to silence two women before the election. According to Cohen, it was Weisselberg who, on Trump's orders, devised the plan to disguise the payment to Stormy Daniels and then reimburse Cohen through false invoices. Cohen said that scheme represented a criminal conspiracy.
Are you telling us, Mr. Cohen, that the president directed transactions in conspiracy with Allen Weisselberg and his son, Donald Trump Jr., as part of a criminal conspiracy of financial fraud? Is that your testimony today?
Yes.
NBC News has learned that the House Intelligence Committee now intends to call Weisselberg to testify. And NBC News is also reporting tonight that Democrats on the House Ways and Means Committee are crafting a request to the IRS for the president's tax returns. I'm joined now by Greg Brower, a former senior FBI official and U.S. attorney. Caroline Fredrickson is president of the American Constitution Society. And Natasha Bertrand is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Natasha, let me just start with you. Well, we mentioned it there. Allen Weisselberg, 45 years around the Trump family business empire. The interesting thing to me about him is when you look at the circle of people around Trump, usually in some way you hear from them in public, you see them. This is somebody who has managed to stay close to Trump and entirely behind the scenes for more than 4 decades. Talk a little bit about the role he plays in Trump's world and what he would potentially be in position to shine a light on.
Yeah, it's really amazing that we've heard nothing from him, but he is apparently obsessively private, and that is how he has managed to escape all of the scrutiny that surrounds the Trump family, right? The Trump Organization is also a very small organization in terms of the amount of people that work there. It's kind of like a mom and pop shop in many ways. So he was able to have visibility as the CFO into virtually everything that the Trump Organization did in terms of its finances. So, for example, when Donald Trump Jr. said that Russian assets and Russian money makes up a disproportionate amount of their assets, of the Trump Organization's assets, Allen Weisselberg is in a position to tell Congress whether or not that's actually true. When we, talk about the sudden spending of millions and millions of dollars in cash by the Trump Organization to buy certain properties, where did that money come from? Allen Weisselberg is in the position to tell Congress, again, where that money came from. How did he insert $200 million into his Scottish golf courses that were failing? Where did he get that money? All things that Allen Weisselberg could potentially be able to answer. And that's what makes him so valuable here is he could say, look, this money potentially came from a foreign entity. This money was used, in an illicit manner. Whether or not he's actually going to testify, though, unless he gets immunity, because, of course, as we've seen, he could be actually, part of these crimes, is another question.
Well, and Caroline, so to that question, then, there's all sorts of possibilities here of things he might know, things he might be able to connect the dots on if there's anything there. But the question is, would he be willing, do you think, to answer any questions on those fronts?
Well, I think Congress is certainly going to put the questions to him. It's hard to know how he's going to get out of coming up before those committees and talking about what he knows. I think the committees learned very clearly from the Cohen hearing that it seems like the Trump Organization is a criminal enterprise. And to get to the bottom of it, they are going to need to follow the money. And the one who knows where the money is Allen Weisselberg.
Well, but Caroline, I guess my question is, Cohen was there voluntarily. He's going to prison in a few weeks. Seems like he was thinking, maybe in terms of his reputation, something was motivating him there to voluntarily appear and say everything he said this week. If you're Allen Weisselberg, what would prevent him from showing up and pleading the Fifth?
Well, he's already cooperating with the Southern District of New York. I think he knows that he's got a lot of liability out there, and it's very, very possible that he could see that it's in his longer-term interest to speak with candor about what he's been involved in and the role that he played in these variety of fraudulent enterprises and the inflating of assets and the deflating of assets and tax fraud and so forth. I mean, he's got a lot at stake, and I think the prosecutors have a fair amount over him. Cooperating with the committees as well may be really in his interest.
Well, I mean, that's a question, too, is sort of a division of labor question, maybe, Greg. If Congress is interested in these things and Weisselberg is not interested in talking about them, is there a concern there if you're Congress and there's the idea of granting some kind of immunity to get him to talk? Does that potentially limit, if you give him immunity to talk to Congress, does that limit the ability of prosecutors potentially to take any steps, any actions?
Potentially. I will tell you, as a former federal prosecutor, anytime you can turn the CFO of an organization, whether it's a small mom and pop, which this organization has been described as, or a large publicly traded company, the CFO is a gold mine of information. If it's a follow the money type of case, which most white collar cases are, it's the CFO you want to get. So here, he's a potentially very valuable witness for both Congress and for prosecutors. And so there has to be a certain amount of deconfliction coordination that takes place in order to maximize his value as a witness for both investigations.
Well, another witness set to testify before the House Intelligence Committee now is Felix Sater, a Russian-born Trump business associate who helped Cohen pursue that Trump Tower project in Moscow. And according to multiple reports, Sater pleaded guilty in the late 90s to stock fraud in connection with the Russian mafia. Yet Trump reportedly worked with him on various projects since at least 2005. In a 2013 deposition, Trump notably downplayed his association with Sater, saying he barely knew him.
If he were sitting in the room right now, I really wouldn't know what he looked like.
Despite Trump's sworn deposition, Cohen testified that the president did know Sater well enough to give him an office in Trump Tower.
Isn't it true that President Trump knew convicted Russian mobster Felix Sater in 2013 when he made that statement?
Yes.
Isn't it true that because of Mr. Sater's relationship to the Trump organization, that he had an office in the Trump Tower?
And on the 26th floor, Mr. Trump.
And the 26th floor is important. Why?
Because it's Mr. Trump's floor.
Based on those facts, isn't it true that President Trump misled at best or worse, lied under oath?
Yes.
And Natasha, look, so this question of Sater and the Trump Tower deal, Cohen, he pleaded guilty. He's pleaded guilty now to lying to Congress over this project, this Trump Moscow project. What light could he shed on it?
A lot. I mean, where to even begin with Felix Sater? It's a completely open secret. I mean, sources have told me that he had this office on the 26th floor in Trump Tower, that he had a standing meeting with Trump every week when he was an advisor to the Trump organization. And I think that he could probably speak to the extent that the negotiations actually went on, right? And it's just another corroborating witness to what Michael Cohen has told the committee. Michael Cohen obviously is not the most credible person in the world, but when you haul Felix Sater before the panel and you ask him to describe all of the efforts he took to pursue this massive real estate deal in 2016 with his Russian contacts, which he boasted about. I mean, he boasted about knowing Putin. He boasted about knowing all sorts of high-level Kremlin officials. When you ask him to go into that in detail, and I think he would be willing to do that because he really is not in kind of the Trump camp at this moment. His allegiance right now is to with, whoever can help him avoid further trouble. Then you could potentially learn a lot. And Cohen could then also gain some credibility by the corroboration that Felix Sater could provide.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.